Hey, Kathleen.
Yes.
It's Scott. I haven't been on a Pathways call in almost a week and I feel lost.
You know what? We're going to catch you up for the next 3 hours, Scott. Don't you worry.
Oh, I'm so glad I'm in the right place.
You, we're crushing it here. Telling you.
Oh, oh.
You've missed a lot. We have a whole stakeholder proposal.
I did see that on the plane ride back. Yeah, I re-engaged to that extent. I went, oh my God, I'm behind.
Welcome back. I hope your time in Montana was restful. It was certainly well deserved.
Oh, the meeting wasn't. You know how you are
Oh,
exhausted after a 2-day meeting with your members. The days afterwards, yeah, they were great.
good. Good. That's all that matters.
All right, good morning to those who have joined us. I think we're starting to reach critical mass. So we'll go ahead and get started just with our welcome, and folks can continue to trickle in before we get to the heart of our meeting today. So this is the fourth of 4 workshops focused on developing a stakeholder engagement process for the regional organization. Serena, next slide. So we spent some good time in July and August talking through what folks would like to see in a proposal. Your stakeholder process work group took the last few weeks to put together a discussion document that they will provide an overview of today. And then there will be an opportunity for you all to provide written comments on that discussion document in addition to whatever feedback you want to share today live during our call. Next slide, please. So our plan for today, we'll do a little bit of welcome and housekeeping. I have another fun icebreaker for you all. Members of the stakeholder process work group and launch committee will walk you through the discussion document that went out on Monday. And then we will have some time for structured Q&A before we take a 10-minute break. And then we'll come back in the latter half of the workshop to open up the floor for more general commentary on the discussion document. And then we will offer some next steps for where we go from here. So with that, as with our previous calls, I'd like to invite folks to introduce themselves. If you're one of our stakeholder process work group members that's going to be presenting on the discussion document today, we'd love to have you introduce yourself ahead of that. If you're someone in the room who expects to participate, we'd also love to have you introduce yourself. And so we're doing name, organization, sector affiliation, and that's the sector as like represented on the launch committee, and I can put those in the chat as well. And then what is one thing you are looking forward to this fall? And so I can model us as folks bravely raise their hand to introduce themselves. My name is Neha Bazaj. I'm a director at GridWorks. I do not have a sector affiliation. And one thing I'm looking forward to this fall is actually just next week. I'm going on a 4-day backpacking trip with a good friend from grad school up in the mountains. So hoping for lots of lake swimming and for the first time ever going on a trip when there's no moon. So hopefully we'll get some good stars. Other folks, go ahead and raise your Zoom hand, or you can go ahead and just come off mute and off camera. And I will cold call. So I know at least in our presenters today, we have, well, Kathleen, Meg, Heidi, Pam, Brian, Josh, Allie, if any of you all would like to introduce yourself. Yes, Meg.
Thank you. It was the cold call that got me to raise my hand. My name is Meg McNall, and I'm with the law firm of Thompson Coburn. I represent a group of municipal utilities in Southern California that are the cities of Anaheim, Azusa, Banning, Colton, Pasadena, and Riverside, California. I don't serve on the launch committee, but the cities that I mentioned are participants in the public power and cooperative sector. I also currently serve as a sector representative for the CAISO PTOs to the Western Energy Markets Regional Issues Forum, and I'm serving as the chair of the RIF this year. Thanks.
Thanks, Meg. Anything you're looking forward to this fall?
My fourth grader is back in school and his soccer season kicks off next week. So I'm looking forward to a fall season full of soccer games. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Meg. Heidi.
Hi all, Heidi Rotz from the Clean Energy Buyers Association, and I'm a launch committee member and also part of the working group on stakeholder process. On the launch committee, I sit within our large commercial industrial customer sector. And for fall, I'm really looking forward to that first trip to Trader Joe's to buy a bunch of pumpkins and everything maple flavored. But as soon as that's available, I'm doing it.
Thanks, Heidi. I know there was a little bit of snow last week, and I think some of the pumpkin spice stuff is coming out early. Josh.
Folks, thanks. Josh Walter, I work at Seattle City Light. I am serving on the launch committee in the public power and co-op sector. Similar to Meg, I'm also a RIF liaison in a different sector, serving as a representative in the EIM sector. Haven't even thought about what's going on this fall, but something I'm looking forward to is a local annual music festival here in Seattle, Bumper Shoot. So that's happening this weekend. Very much looking forward to that.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Josh. Brian.
Howdy, folks. Brian Turner with Advanced Energy United. We're a trade association of clean energy technology providers, and I sit on the launch committee representing a sector called technology providers. And as we'll hear today, might best crosswalk with a sector called DER providers, distributed energy resources. And this weekend, I also get to go backpacking. First one this summer. It's as I get older, it's so much harder to get out, but hitting the Sierra Nevada, some of the classic high Sierra terrain. So really looking forward to that.
Great. Maybe I will run into you out there. Kathleen.
Me, Kathleen, or Kathleen Colbert?
Oh, well, Kathleen Colbert introduced herself in the chat, so I'll call on you, Kathleen Stacks.
All right. I refer to Kathleen Colbert as cool Kathleen, so we've got that delineation. I'm Kathleen Staggs. I'm the executive director of Western Freedom and also one of the launch committee co-chairs. I represent the large commercial industrial customer sector along with Heidi. And I am kind of looking forward to football season. There's something great about sitting in the backyard, watching football and drinking a beer in a sweatshirt. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathleen. Pam.
I'm Pam Sporborg. I'm the director for transmission and markets at Portland General Electric. I am the other co-chair with Kathleen of the launch committee, and I represent the investor and utility sector. So it's a long introduction there. And for the fall, I'm most looking forward to back to school. Yesterday was my daughter's first day back to school, and it means the chaos of the summer turns into a normal routine of the fall. And I'm very much looking forward to getting into that normal routine.
Great. Thanks, Pam. Anyone else? That was a lot of our stakeholder process work group and launch committee members. Other folks who have had an opportunity to look at the discussion document and have thoughts and opinions that they intend to share later today. We'd love to hear from you. Obviously, we'll hear from you later as well, but anyone else who would like to introduce themselves?
Hi there, I'm Brian Hannigan. I'm president and CEO at Holy Cross Energy, Western Colorado Electric Cooperative. Just keeping track of the evolving discussions here in the West as we look at our evolution towards a goal of 100% carbon-free energy by 2030. We're 80% of the way there and looking to Western markets to help us close the gap. So mostly listening in and formulating thoughts. Yeah, looking forward to much cooler fall weather with less risk of wildfire.
Cheers to that. All right. Any last brave souls before I turn things over to Pam and Kathleen to get the discussion document presentation started? All right. Great. Well, with that, Pam, Kathleen, I will hand things off to you to walk us through the discussion document.
Thanks, Neha. And welcome, everyone. It is good to see yet another well-attended workshop. I just want to take a minute to thank you all for participating in this series of workshops. This is our last one. And we have received a lot of really good feedback that I think we have really been striving to incorporate into our evolving proposals. So thank you for both your comments and participation in the workshops, and for the written comments that you have, many of you have submitted on our previous workshop topics. We're looking forward to hearing feedback on the discussion document that we sent out earlier this week. Sorry for not giving you more time, but this has really been the result of a lot of work. And I also want to take a minute to thank all of the work group members for all of the time and input that they have provided into this. I think one of the things that's worth highlighting in this document that you will see is that we were able to, I think, find a pretty sweet spot that builds on experiences, not just in the CAISO and SPP, which are really, obviously sort of the main market constructs and stakeholder processes that we're engaging in here, but draws on experience and a lot of the research that the GridWorks team did for us about the way stakeholder processes are run in RTOs and ISOs across the country. So this is we're really excited about the alignment and agreement that we've been able to find on some of these topics like sectors and voting, and even the process for working together between stakeholders and staff, and who drives these conversations and how does that collaboration happen, all with the mind of how do we propose something that is going to enable stakeholders to meaningfully engage in this, to help craft solutions, but also do it within a reasonable amount of resources, recognizing that we have a lot of different kinds of stakeholders who have a varying degree of resources and ability to engage on many of these topics. So those were some of the things that we were thinking about. In addition to that, recognizing that we're talking about culture and things that people are very used to. Some things work really well for some people, some things don't. And so how we find, again, this sort of sweet spot for being able to recommend something that touches on a lot of the aspects that people really do like in an accessible and engageable way. So that's sort of the intro of what we were thinking about and driving towards with this document. And you're gonna, I think the other just sort of reminder, this specific work group was unique among our work groups that we've had working over the last few months, in that we had a few folks from outside the launch committee willing to join and provide their really valuable insight and experience. You're going to hear from some of those folks today, but I just want to, I am deeply grateful for all of the time and work that everyone has put into this, and I'm hoping that we're creating a process that, regardless of what the result of the market footprint looks like in the West, this is something that people are able to and look forward to engaging with as we move forward. So with that, we can go to the next slide. maybe a couple just notes on this. This is a discussion document. We kind of toyed with the idea of like, is this our proposal or is this just a starting point? And I think there are a lot of things in this that we really do want to get feedback on. And so while we've captured quite a few ideas that this work group found some alignment on, there are still we still want to hear input. Did we hit the right sweet spot? Do people want to see something in one direction or another that we didn't capture here? This also is not a fully comprehensive document for an entire stakeholder process, which would make it much longer than it is right now. So I think we wanted to ensure that we were able to put out enough detail and enough structure that we could get some really good discussion and feedback on, while at the same time recognizing that this is going to continue to be something that evolves. This is another unique aspect of this work stream, is that we envisioned that this work would continue even beyond our September step 2 proposal release date. So we anticipate that there's just going to continue to be evolution and tweaking and continuing to work out some of these details over the coming months. And we also envision that, once this thing actually gets started, we're going to need to continue to revisit and make sure that the pieces that we end up proposing actually do work and accomplish the goals of a stakeholder process. Next slide, please. We have a handful of areas that we want some feedback from stakeholders on. And again, I kind of touched on this. A couple of things. We recognize this is an area where we are proposing a staffing structure. We're talking about a staffing structure for something that doesn't exist yet, that we haven't quite nailed down as far as how big is this new regional organization going to be. And recognizing that this is an area in particular that the RO and the CAISO are going to be working very closely together. Would love your thoughts as stakeholders on the potential roles and responsibilities for the staff at the RO related to this stakeholder process. So we want to just, I think, flag that we recognize that we are talking about existing jobs here and people who work these jobs every day at the CAISO, and so we want to be very sensitive to that fact and just get input on this structure so that as we move forward, we can continue to work with the CAISO to find a solution that supports those people who are already doing a lot of this work today. And I think I've talked a little bit about the balance and sort of this sweet spot that we've been looking for. So want to hear from you all. Does this meet your expectations? Does this feel like something that you'd be able to meaningfully engage in? That's really the perspective that we want today. How can you engage in the process that we're proposing? Next slide. We're going to hear from a handful of different folks today, and I think with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pam, who's really going to be facilitating the discussion of what's in this document.
Thanks, Kathleen. So we're going to work through this section of the agenda, starting with an overview of the Stakeholder Representatives Committee, which is an evolution of the Regional Issues Forum. We will talk through what sectors are in this discussion document and a brief touch on voting, where the majority of that voting conversation will happen much later in the conversation. We will then talk through the classification of stakeholder initiatives, how we can potentially put those initiatives into different categories of stakeholder initiative and help with that categorization to drive the prioritization process. Then we will really get into some of the details of an evolved stakeholder process. And a lot of this work has been happening organically. And so a lot of this is where we are going to put a little bit more detail to some of the process that takes place today and offer some refinements to really bring more of the voice of the stakeholder into that process. And then finally, we will get to our voting proposal that will again seeks to balance providing transparency around the perspectives of stakeholders on a sector and diversity basis, while also allowing some of the flexibility that we've heard is really important and valuable in the current process and how it can be balanced as we move forward. Next slide. So Meg, I believe you're up to walk us through the Stakeholder Representatives Committee proposal.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, so I'm going to get us kicked off here with just a brief overview of the discussion documents proposal regarding the Stakeholder Representatives Committee and talk at a high level about the sectors that will be included in the SRC and touch a little bit on voting, although as Pam mentioned, we have a pretty extensive discussion later in the workshop this morning about the elements of the discussion document and how it proposes to address voting. So the Stakeholder Representatives Committee, as outlined in the discussion paper, is really an analog of the current Regional Issues Forum. But as you read down into some of the elements of the stakeholder process itself, it really does contemplate an expanded role relative to what the RIF is doing today. So as we've envisioned the SRC will be the primary stakeholder body that works with the RO staff to prioritize initiatives and define initiative problem statements and solutions. Currently, the RIF today participates in an annual roundtable process regarding initiative classification and priorities. And that responsibility would be transitioned over to the SRC, which would have a much more, I would say, in-depth involvement in the prioritization process. The goal of the SRC, as is, I think, a goal of the RIF, is to promote compromise and collaboration both within and across the sectors and among stakeholders. And so to that end, we have decided to preserve the sector structure with some refinements that we'll get to in a second. We've also maintained the structure whereby sector representatives, currently they're called liaisons, would manage the work of the SRC as the liaisons do today with respect to the RIF. In terms of selecting SRC representatives, we have not prescribed really a lot of process or criteria around how that happens. We prefer instead to defer to the sectors in terms of how the composition of the representatives would be determined, but we also recognize that many of the sectors are very diverse in terms of characteristics like geography and business type. And so we think it would be incumbent on each of the sectors to recognize that there are criteria or factors that the sectors may wish to use in appointing their representatives. The SRC representatives would be responsible for communicating with the organizations that are members of that sector and kind of keeping the sector organized, both in terms of eliciting and providing feedback around the prioritization of stakeholder initiatives, positions of individual entities regarding different stakeholder topics, and as we'll talk about a little bit more, coordinating and organizing the sector in terms of the voting process. So why don't we go to the next couple of slides, which discuss sectors and voting, and then maybe handle questions, or is the preference to handle questions at the end?
Meg, we'll handle questions all at the end.
The end of the
I'll have
complete
presented, yeah.
presentation. All right, thanks a lot. So in terms of the SRC sectors, in some ways this looks a lot like the sectors we have now. under the RIF. We have a sector with 1 seat for the EDAM entities, 2 seats for entities that are EIM entities under the CAISO tariff. And we have a little bit of a variation in terms of the power marketing administrations. Currently, the PMAs are a standalone sector. And this proposal suggests that one approach that stakeholders could consider is transitioning that into one of the other either EDAM or EIM entities sector with a particular seat reserved for that, for the PMA entities. The proposal maintains 2 seats for the CAISO PTO sector. And we have a sector today that's called the consumer-owned utilities, and we are suggesting a nomenclature change there to transmission-dependent utilities. And because that is a large sector and one that we're proposing be expanded to include community choice aggregator entities, we are suggesting an additional seat for that sector. We have a seat for the public interest organizations and a seat for the consumer advocate entities. Currently, those 2 categories of stakeholders are in a combined sector, and they have organized themselves in a way that the PIOs appoint 1 sector representative and the consumer advocates appoint 1. This proposal kind of breaks that approach apart. There is a sector, and this is new, for commercial and industrial customers. We have an expanded sector representation for the IPP and marketing sector, and we have specified that independent transmission developers are included in this sector as well. And finally, we have a seat and a sector for entities that provide distributed energy resource services, as that is obviously an emerging area. And we currently have that to some extent covered in the IPP and marketing sector, but because there is a difference in interest there, we thought it would make sense to separate that sector. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is obviously a new element relative to what the RIF does today, but we do have a concept that entails sector level tabulations of voting. And so as outlined in the discussion document, when there is a vote that takes place on an element of the stakeholder process, whether that's prioritization of initiatives, a stage in proposal development, or at another point identified by the SRC, individual organizations will participate in the vote. Those individual organizational votes will then be tabulated or tallied to form a sector position for each of the 9 sectors. So while we have this slide, and it refers to kind of in a shorthand way as SRC sector voting, what we really have is a sector level tabulation of individual entity votes. There's not a separate sort of SRC sector vote that will take place, but the SRC representatives would be responsible for reviewing and interpreting that sector level tally of the votes and providing appropriate context, whether it be to the RO staff or the RO governing authority, as to what that vote means within a sector. So for example, if a particular sector has a 2/3, 1/3 split in favor of a particular proposal, it would be incumbent on the SRC representative to explain sort of the context behind that vote, so that while a majority of sector members may support a particular proposal, a subset, and there could be a pattern to the subset, or it could just be the results of the individual preferences of the organizations making up the minority tally. It would be incumbent on the SRC representative to kind of explain the reasons behind that vote, as the SRC representative understands them. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot more about voting and the voting process that the discussion paper outlines, but I think we can go to the next slide to talk about the next topic, which is initiative. Oh, before we move to that, just at a high level, our comments template seeks feedback both on the proposed structure and responsibilities of the SRC and seeks feedback on the proposed sectors. So if you have comments or suggestions, I think the working group that is participating would love to hear your input and feedback there. Thanks.
Thank you, Meg. Robert, I see your hand. Is this a clarifying question? I think we're going to try to hold most questions to the end, but if you have a clarification, please go ahead.
Yeah, just on the transmission dependent utility sector, could someone help me understand what the rationale was for reserving a seat for CCAs? Thank you.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. And if others would like to weigh in, I think the thought there was that the current consumer-owned utilities sector may not be a precise fit for community choice aggregators, because unlike some of the consumer-owned utilities, they do not sort of own a transmission or a distribution system in quite the same way. They have a slightly different set of interests, and at the same time, they serve a significant amount of load within the footprint. And so the thought process was to recognize that category of entity.
Thank you.
I think we can spend more time kind of going through those questions when we reach the end, but I want to turn it over to Heidi to walk us through the classification of stakeholder initiatives.
Thanks, Pam. So I'm going to walk through these 3 classifications that we've developed for stakeholder initiatives. And for each, I'll talk about how they arise, how they're treated, and then provide examples where it makes sense. So this first classification are compliance and non-discretionary items. So these are initiatives that address compliance with a FERC order, or maybe correct market design, or deal with an emerging reliability issue. So for issues that are tied to a FERC rulemaking, there likely will be time for a full stakeholder process. And we're actually going to walk through that pretty quick later on in the next section. These issues would be raised by the RO board or staff, and then go into the catalog and roadmap, and their timing is going to depend on compliance. For issues in this classification that deal with exigent circumstances, these initiatives are more of temporary tariff changes that are made without a stakeholder process. So they'll still need to go through that process to become lasting. That review is going to need to start no later than 30 days after FERC approval, and it must be approved within 6 months. Or there's the opportunity for the board to vote to extend this timeline in 6-month increments, and that's really to allow more stakeholder development. And then the last under this bucket, issues addressing minor corrections or developments. They're likely related to a tariff filing at FERC that also went through a stakeholder process. So RO staff may forego one, but they would have to notify the SRC or the board. Let's move to the next slide. So this classification is around stakeholder initiatives related to state or local public policy. So these initiatives are put forward by an entity who may be impacted by state or local policy or law that requires a tariff change. This could be a state agency representative, it could be the state's committee or BOSSer representative, or it could be a market participant. Their proposal is going to need to include why the initiative was necessary to comply with the policy or law, and whether implementation of that policy into the market is going to adversely affect other states. From there, if the RO staff determines that a tariff change is required and there aren't adverse impact to other states, the initiative is treated the same as compliance or non-discretionary initiatives, similar to what we just discussed. So they'll go into the catalog and roadmap, and then the timing is based on the compliance requirement. However, if the RO staff determines that a tariff change isn't necessary, or that other states would be adversely impacted, they must document their findings and present them to the RO board. So this allows stakeholders, including the state's committee or BOSSer representatives, to comment on this finding. Let's move to the last bucket. So these are discretionary initiatives. So think of market improvements or evolutions that could be brought by any stakeholder and are likely going to emerge from a workshop. And we have 3 different flavors in this bucket. So the first are emergent operational issues. So these are tariff changes addressing a significant market design flaw, reliability impairment, or matter that significantly impacts a particular set of entities. So this, for example, could be a market design problem that undermines the reliability of a particular BA, but they fall short of exigent circumstances. These could include issues of importance identified by our RO staff. They could be raised by the States Committee or BOSSer. They could be raised by the market monitor, the MSC, the independent market advisor, or a market participant. These initiatives still require a stakeholder process, but they're going to be handled with a greater degree of urgency than a normal discretionary initiative. And another example could be price formation enhancements. So let's move on to the next slide. There's 2 other types of these discretionary initiatives. So one are discrete ones. So these are clear ideas that need to address known problems. They would be able to move directly to the policy development stage. So when we talk about stakeholder initiatives in a moment, there's a stage 1 and a stage 2. Or they proceed to resolution through another means, which could be the business practice manual change or a tariff amendment. And then the last bucket here are conceptual under discretionary initiatives. So broad topics where many stakeholders agree there's an opportunity to improve the market, but there's really no clear consensus. This topic needs to go into working group discussions at stage 1. So like I mentioned, there's a stage 1 and stage 2 we'll look at in order to determine the scope of problem and create a problem statement. So there could be several subtopics related to these issues. It could include price formation enhancement, greenhouse gas coordination, or gas resource management. And then the areas for feedback that we're looking for, we'd really like to get some feedback on the classifications that we just laid out, the 3 buckets. And we'd also like to hear feedback regarding the proposed approach to compliance with the state and local public policy category. In particular, that one we would like a lot of feedback on. Back to you, Pam.
Thank you, Heidi. It's my turn to walk you through the stakeholder process. So in the stakeholder process section, we're going to first talk about issue identification and prioritization. The second piece will be the different working groups, and then the third piece will be approval by the RO board. My colleagues Brian and Josh will be coming in to talk about those second and third items. The second item, stage 1 and stage 2 problems, as we work through this stakeholder process section of the proposal. And this, I think, gets pretty complicated, so please stick with us as we work through these different sections, and hopefully it will all come together as we talk through these different pieces. So in terms of the issue identification and prioritization, this is a very active slide, but as we talk through it, it should start to feel really comfortable to folks who have participated in the catalog and road mapping process previously. So the first piece, if you look across the top, we'll first talk about issue identification and prioritization. Then we will talk about the stakeholder initiative phase. And then the third piece, we will get to the approval by the RO board. So we'll first here talk about the annual catalog proposals, including the 3 different types of initiatives that were described by Heidi. And then we will work through the different pieces of those initiatives. So the first piece of the issue identification and prioritization is, how do you really build the stakeholder catalog? The stakeholder catalog, I think we referred to this previously as the place where good ideas go to die. And so how do we really change that from just a catalog into a document that includes positive ideas and a process for determining which of those ideas we want to take from concept all the way through a stakeholder initiative? So the first piece is to just build that catalog. That catalog will take recommendations from all sources, from stakeholders and market participants, from all of the different sectors that we talked about in Meg's section. We can include ideas from the RO staff, from state regulators, from other members of the public policy community. And these ideas will essentially go into the catalog first. Once we've developed that catalog process, then we can start to develop that roadmap. The roadmap is actually the document that will reflect what of those ideas become the most prioritized by stakeholders to go through an initiative development, a development process. And that roadmap will look out for a 3-year period, reflecting the fact that some of these initiatives are particularly complex and will require more than 1 year to move through the stakeholder process. We recommend that these 2 documents are updated annually, and that the number and complexity of these initiatives are pieces that the RO staff can provide input and feedback on based on the staffing and budget allocated to stakeholder initiatives. I think we'd all love to do more things, or there's always more good ideas than can be achieved at any one time. And reflecting the kind of engagement constraints from both the RO staffing side as well as stakeholder participation constraints is an important piece of getting that balance right. Then we also believe the catalog and roadmap should inform the budget of the RO and vice versa. As we see even today that engagement and desire by stakeholders to balance as with speed is an important piece of the way that the stakeholder process can evolve. So to get a little bit more detailed into the catalog process and this, I really issue an initiative identification. So we recommend that every year there's a standing process to identify initiatives for inclusion in the catalog, and also to drop initiatives that have either been addressed or where the market has really evolved to no longer need that initiative. I think one of the tendencies among us as humans is to always want to add things, but also to have a harder time letting certain things go. So we want to make sure that we're really narrowing in on the most important issues. So we also recognize that some of the compliance and non-discretionary initiatives will be automatically included in the catalog. And then working through the stakeholder committee to assist and identify the discretionary initiatives that will be included in the catalog through that roundtable type process. The RIF has really started this engagement through the roundtable process, and we recommend the continuation and expansion of this work to identify, to really emphasize and put the stakeholder representatives committee at the front and center of organizing and advocating for appropriate sector initiatives that really matter to each of their sectors. So once we've really had this, again, emphasizing that these non-discretionary initiatives can originate from any source. There are a diverse number of sources in the stakeholder community. And then we also recommend that the catalog include a proposed disposition for all submittals. So we recognize that not all ideas will require a tariff amendment. And so we recommend that there be a process where those initiatives or concepts that could be addressed through another process are correctly moved over to that process. For example, the business practice manual change management process is a place where ideas or concepts that don't necessarily need a tariff change can be effectuated. And then based on the input with collaboration with the Stakeholder Representatives Committee, the staff will release the draft catalog and again hold at least one stakeholder meeting with a comment period to ensure that this disposition process is correctly capturing the feedback from stakeholders, with a final catalog released as part of this process. So then we get into probably the more challenging piece. How do you move from a list of good ideas to a roadmap on executing on those ideas? So the roadmap process, in terms of prioritization, we recommend that either the stakeholder committee or a subcommittee would work directly with the RO staff regarding the prioritization of discretionary initiatives in the catalog. We recommend that the sector members will participate in a ranking of those initiative catalogs, and that we would and that the stakeholder prioritization process would be directly reflected in the selection criteria for inclusion in the discretionary initiative process. The stakeholder representatives committee would conduct a non-binding vote on the roadmap prior to the presentation to the staff. So the roadmap development includes these following steps. Again, I think this is an iterative process with, I think, a lot of back and forth to ensure that we're really getting the right balance and providing sufficient input for stakeholders to engage with what makes it into the initiative prioritization process. So publishing the catalog with the stakeholder representatives committee, taking public comment on that, hosting a public meeting, engaging in that revision for the roadmap, and then providing an opportunity for all stakeholders to take an indicative vote. And we'll get into the details of that later in the presentation. That vote will inform revisions to the roadmap and the publication of the final roadmap. And that we also recommend that the final roadmap is presented to the board along with the results of that indicative vote, and that the RO board does take an active vote on the roadmap, which is an enhancement from today where there's an informational presentation. So again, there's a component of this prioritization in the roadmap. We recommend that compliance initiatives are automatically included in the roadmap, including state and local public policy compliance. We see that as actually a compliance obligation as well, where compliance requirements could originate from either the FERC or from a state law. And then I think we're very close on time, so maybe continue to move forward. And then really getting into the discretionary initiatives process. And so I think the idea here, one of the things that we've heard from stakeholders is the value of building in enough flexibility to address emergent operational issues. And these are matters of urgent importance to the market or particular set of market participants that really come abreast or come to light based on the operational circumstances. And most of these actually do not rise to the level of exigent circumstance. Our discussions have identified how narrow that category is, but we do want to make sure that there is flexibility to address these emergent operational issues in a timely manner and build in enough flexibility to address those as they arise. I think especially as we've seen so much volatility and really extreme weather that has highlighted some unexpected challenges across the region. We want to be able to quickly respond to those learnings and challenges and make sure that the market is set up to reliably and equitably address emerging circumstances. And then the discrete initiatives, working through this roundtable process to prioritize this discrete initiatives through either one or more meetings to identify the appropriate work product on the discrete initiatives. And then I also think there's this piece on conceptual initiatives. We've identified discrete initiatives where the problem statement is well known But we've also talked about these conceptual initiatives that are really similar more to the working group process that we have today. And I think given our time constraints, I think it's appropriate for maybe Brian to spend a little bit more time talking through how these conceptual initiatives will get to have more of their own engagement and opportunity for stakeholders to really identify areas, really broad areas of the market that need to be addressed, but where there isn't a specific set of problem statements that are really ready to be moved through the more formal initiative process. And as part of this process, we recommend that there be support from at least 2 sectors so that those sectors can be directly involved with the moving forward of the working groups. We've seen that balance with having these working groups be very stakeholder driven, very much work, like having stakeholders come to stakeholders drive this process is an important part of ensuring that these working groups are able to keep moving forward and not get stuck in a not get stuck in that problem definition phase. So that's an important part of the commitment to running a working group, is to have dedicated stakeholder support for that process. So I think I am more than out of time, and maybe I think jumping ahead to let Brian really talk through stage 1 that will, I think, help get us to stay on our agenda, and then hopefully we can circle back to questions at the end.
Let's pause here. Sorry. Thanks, Pam. Let's pause here on this slide just momentarily. I'm going to be talking about stage 1 with the little red star there, the first red star, and then I'll hand it over to Josh Walter to talk about stage 2. Next slide, please. So the purpose of stage 1 is to narrow and define the problem that we are trying to solve. This involves defining the initiative objective, listing the issues that are in scope for the initiative, and hopefully capturing or encompassing these issues and objectives in a nice, concise problem statement. The problem statement then is used to guide the development of proposals and the evaluation of whether and how well proposals solve the problem in stage 2. I want to emphasize here that we don't anticipate stage 1 would be necessary for non-discretionary initiatives in which the RO staff will have defined the problem statement based on FERC requirements, if that's the origin of the non-discretionary initiative, or the exigent circumstances, or other non-discretionary initiatives. We also don't anticipate it necessary for discretionary discrete initiatives in which the problem is defined very well in the issue identification and prioritization process, also known as the catalog and roadmap process. So stage 1 really will mostly apply to more conceptual discretionary initiatives where the stakeholders have identified a market need or opportunity, but have not narrowly defined the scope of issues to be included or defined a concise problem statement. And we propose that for these initiatives, the SRC would identify sector sponsors to act as chair and co-chair of the work group. Now, this is probably the 2 sectors that supported the addition of this conceptual initiative that Pam described when it got into the catalog process. So they would probably be the chair and co-chair, but the SRC would be able to identify who those chair and co-chair of the work group would be. Now, we also anticipate that state and local initiatives may sometimes go through a stage 1 process if the issue scope and problem statement is still undefined, or they may go direct to stage 2 where it's a more narrow issue and problem. Next slide, please. So what's included in stage 1? First, the sector sponsors would really be the lead for shaping the work group, process, composition, objectives, etc. They would work in cooperation with the SRC as a whole, but they define the timeline for the initiative, the number and cadence of meetings, the stakeholder roles, and defining when to expect the problem statement to be complete and ready for a SRC vote to move on to stage 2. RO staff and the SRC as a whole would review the proposed initiative and put it forward to a SRC vote to make a recommendation to the RO staff to move the initiative to stage 2. So that's a voting threshold there, advisory vote to the RO staff about when the problem statement is sufficient to support a more focused stage 2 policy development. And then there's a bit of repetition of previous points. I think if it already has a problem statement, it doesn't need to go through stage 1. I want to emphasize the last line here where the SRC retains flexibility to create a working group, even for discrete initiatives. And the purpose of this is to allow sector sponsors that have identified a relatively narrow fix to a problem. For instance, where sector sponsors have defined a relatively narrow fix to a discrete issue, they can really drive the solution perhaps more rapidly or with less reliance on the RO staff, or to ensure that it is prioritized, they can take on more of a role here by forming a working group even around a discrete initiative. And with that, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to hand over to Josh to talk about stage 2. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, moving from phase 1, where stakeholders, the SRC and RO staff work towards creating an initiative problem statement. Phase 2 involves creating a solution. As Heidi and Pam discussed earlier, the 3 categories or classifications of the initiatives, compliance, state and local, and discretionary, each category has different levels of responsibility between the SRC, the RO staff, the regional regulatory community, and the general stakeholder community. This slide kind of identifies the who is responsible for developing straw proposal solutions. For compliance, non-discretionary, FERC rulemaking responses, that falls within the RO staff to develop a straw proposal. For stakeholder review, exigent circumstances, similarly, RO staff should develop a straw proposal with some time limitations or constraints associated with how that is, after the fact, reviewed and approved through the process. We are proposing 30 days after FERC approval and within 6 months for board approval. And then for minor corrections or adjustments, RO staff may forego a full process, but there should be a notification to the SRC, market participants, or the general stakeholder community, and of course the RO board. Next slide. Or compliance with state and local public policy, the States Committee or the BOSSER members can put forward straw proposals or recommend a work group to identify and discuss proposals to address compliance. So that allows for a mix of the working group model coupled with a need coming out of the state local with a compliance obligation associated with the state and local policy directive. And then thirdly, there's the discretionary initiatives. So they're categorized as emergent operational issues, discrete initiatives, and conceptual initiatives. For each of these, the emergent operational issues would be covered through RO staff to develop a straw proposal, obviously through and with the input of step 1 and the workshop model. Discrete initiatives, the RO staff are responsible for driving the initiative towards solution. But including at least one stakeholder meeting, including comment periods, and the iteration process of potential, additional straw proposals in between, similar to CAISO's current stakeholder process. The SRC sector sponsors may take the lead to develop, to help in the development of straw proposals. And then there's the conceptual initiatives. Conceptual initiatives from stage 1 will evolve into discrete initiatives, similarly to the discrete initiatives as addressed earlier, but most likely with a higher level of involvement from the stakeholder community and the workshop, workshop model. Next slide. Moving from responsibilities to identification of solutions. The work groups will be an integral part of coming towards a solution, or looking and working towards a solution. These are ad hoc committees created specifically to address the topic at hand within the initiative. They're created and dissolved at the discretion of the SRC, and work on an initiative for several. Work could move and be within these topics a multi-year endeavor. I think, as referenced in the next bullet, something like what we're working on and towards in the GRC, GHG work group at CAISO right now. That's a great example of how a difficult issue could linger for a longer time period. The SRC may create standing committees to work on initiatives, as mentioned, similar to the GHG issue or discrete balancing authority issues. The RO staff can establish the maximum number of stage 1 and stage 2 processes, but needs to operate within the constraints of budget and bandwidth. RO staff support the work groups in coordination with the stakeholder co-chairs. One approach used in other regions that encourages coordination and collaboration has been a RO staff and a RO staff person coupled with an SRC or a subject matter expert from the stakeholder community, chairing and co-chairing the work group. So that is definitely on the table. Next slide. Okay, so during the policy development phase, the work groups would continue to assist the RO staff with weighing stakeholder input, and on an as needed basis to help ensure alignment with issue statements developed during the policy development phase. And I think for the sake of time, I think for the most part, this is largely speaking to the coordination between RO staff, the SRC, and the stakeholder community. So with that, in light of time, I am going to hand it back over to Pam.
Thanks, Josh. So once we've gone through all of these different processes, we get to approval by the RO board. So I think a lot of this, it looks very similar to what we have today, except that we will layer in some engagement with the stakeholder representatives committee, including an informational vote. And that vote will be talked about extensively in our next section, so stay tuned for that. But once we have that final proposal, it is ready to be presented to the RO board for consideration. We do recommend that staff takes the lead in preparing these board materials, but that we do recommend that the stakeholder committee is empowered to and encouraged to share and provide opinions to the RO board, either at their meeting directly or through board memos on key decisional items of these discrete initiatives. So we recognize that the SRC might get more engaged with the documentation and the identification of stakeholder perspectives and views on the proposal, especially identifying open or unresolved issues that could indicate, provide that nuance in the terms of sector voting. We believe, again, emphasizing that voting is not the only tool that we have in terms of being able to communicate sector positions, but really making sure that we empower the SRC to provide that nuance around where their sector is in terms of supporting that policy proposal, or if there are components or modifications that could bring about that support. And then the SRC can also report to the board on how that initiative process was conducted and the opportunity to really address the policy priorities that were originally identified by stakeholders and how that evolution took place. So yeah, so we're here finally at our third box, our final star, where the policy proposal is ready to be moved to the board. And okay, so on this very complex and integrated area, where we're seeking feedback is regarding some of the level of stakeholder-driven process versus staff-driven process. Is there enough ability for stakeholders to really engage and drive the process, or the board to manage resources and drive the process to conclusion? And again, I think as we've moved through some of these areas quickly in the interest of time, recognizing that as we get into the stakeholder question period, we can definitely go back and revisit these slides in terms of more detail. The second question that we're seeking feedback on is regarding your ability to support this framework from a resource perspective. We recognize that engaging in working groups requires organizations to commit internal staffing resources or trade association resources to deeply engage and drive these proposals forward, and that represents an increased resource requirement from stakeholders, a potential increase in that requirement. So we want your opinion on what aspects would enable your organization specifically to be really effective in that participation, and what barriers it might create to participation if we're asking for more stakeholder involvement. And also the next question, do you feel that your sector could support participation from a resource perspective, and does that address individual barriers to participation, or what other ways could we address those barriers to participation? And as always, feedback and reactions to the overall process that is posted. Kathleen, I do see your hand up. I know we're running pretty close to our time here, and maybe ask if you could hold that question for the question period. And with that, I will turn it to Allie to walk us through the voting section.
All right, great. Thank you, Pam. Well, there have been a lot of references to voting throughout the earlier sections, and we had I had a question about voting in the last round of stakeholder comments, so appreciate everyone chiming in with their perspective in that last round. So we have developed a voting proposal that, as with the other pieces, we'll be seeking input on. So I'm going to walk through what is in the voting proposal and what we're looking at for voting overview. So just to start off with, I'll do a quick overview of some of the drivers for doing voting and some of the sort of key principles we've looked at in voting. As I think we recognize, it has a number of potential benefits for stakeholder engagement and building compromise and collaboration. So we want to develop a voting structure that really motivates compromise and collaboration amongst within and between sectors. Transparency is important for this. So voting results would be made public and they should be able to be tabulated across different groups and subgroups. So you're not only seeing it by sector, but seeing where it applies, things like geography or type of entity. And we will talk more about that towards the end. And then another thing that we have talked about and heard loudly in the comments, that voting should be advisory or indicative. So it is advisory, but it should serve as influential data for consideration by the RO board. So still, of course, we have the independent RO board. We want them able to make decisions, but the voting is advisory to inform their decision making. So let's go to the next slide. I'll walk through the details of what is in the document. Okay, so first of all, the question of who votes. So at the sector level, each sector has one vote. Now, as Meg alluded to, this doesn't mean each sector member, each sector on the SRC is just casting its vote. The way the sector vote is created is a bottom-up vote from the members of the sector. So you have each of the registered organizations voting, and then the results of that are tallied up and rolled up to the sector level. And the SRC representatives would facilitate votes of the individual organizations and use that to determine the position of the sector level voting. So sector level voting is sort of math of what is done, what the individual votes are. One area I'll flag that we're interested in feedback on is whether sectors could either have kind of overarching guidelines of consistency in how the votes are conducted and how they're tallied. For example, simple majority is always prevails, or 75% majority prevails, or that could be left up to each individual sector to have flexibility. There are some pros and cons of both, so definitely interested in your feedback on that. But we do propose we would want the RO staff to create an automated voting and reporting system so that it can be used and each sector member does not have to manage the administrative aspects of the voting. One element we've added is that in order to vote, a stakeholder would need to register in a specific sector with the regional organization. There would not be a fee for this, but it would be a registration. So there's knowledge of who is in which sector and each entity selects its sector, and entities also agree to a code of conduct as a stakeholder. If stakeholders didn't register or didn't want to agree to this code of conduct, they could of course still participate, but they wouldn't be voting through the voting system. And if there are disputes regarding sector assignments, those would be reviewed by the RO board. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so the question of when does voting happen? We talked about this throughout the stakeholder process. So the votes would be conducted at the following stages in the process. So the first is in the policy roadmap process. So this would be voting to recommend approval of the roadmap. This vote would be advisory to the RO board because it would be conducted before the roadmap is sent to the RO board for its approval. Within the work group and initiative process, at the problem statement and scope definition stage, that first stage, there would be a vote to recommend moving forward from work group to initiative, basically approving the problem statement. That would really be advisory to the RO staff because at that point the board probably wouldn't be involved, but the RO staff would be the ones moving it forward. The next stage is the straw proposal. So it would be a vote to recommend moving forward from a straw proposal to a draft final proposal. That vote is also advisory to the regional organization staff because they're the ones moving it forward. And then finally, at the final proposal. So there would be a vote to recommend moving a proposal to the RO board for approval. And that one is advisory to the RO board because that would be conducted just before it goes to the RO board. As we noted in the stakeholder initiative walkthrough, some initiatives like compliance-driven initiatives might not go through all of the process above. In addition, the RO board or staff could call for a vote at other stages if it was at a time that would be useful or that they really needed to gauge where the stakeholders are on an issue. Stakeholders as a whole would have to agree to doing that vote, but it could be used as a tool in other places in the process. Let's move on to the next slide. So how is voting used? I touched on this in the intro. Voting is advisory. The goal is to provide visibility and guidance to the SRC, the market operator, the states committee or BOSSer, pick its name, the RO staff, and ultimately to the RO board. And it would be indicative of whether the widespread support exists for the initiative, or whether it would also help identify whether there are particular sectors or certain subgroups that are strongly opposed or strongly support an initiative. One that came up in our conversation a lot was geography. This might reveal where there's a geographic split amongst entities that would be important for the RO board to be aware of. And we also have developed some additional tools to try to build compromise and collaboration and to define the process in certain voting outcomes. So I'm going to talk through those quickly next. We go to the next slide. So the first one is an automatic remand. So what this essentially is defining criteria that would be a threshold that represents significant opposition. And that would trigger a remand to the stakeholder process to address the stakeholder concerns and achieve broader support. So we're looking for feedback on this. It's in the feedback questions. But right now, the suggested criteria for significant opposition is, the first would be strong opposition in the sectors. It's defined as 1/3 of the sectors at 70% or more opposed. So that percentage is the underlying votes. So maybe it passed because the majority of sectors supported, but you've got 1/3 of the sectors with this strong opposition in their underlying votes. And then a second criteria could be just a lack of consensus. A simple majority of sectors opposes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So in the automatic remand, like I said, it would be sending it back to the stakeholder process to rework. A proposal may continue forward despite significant opposition if the RO staff thinks that the initiative is time sensitive, if it has importance to the justness and reasonableness of the overall market, or if it addresses particular circumstances of a market participant or a group of participants. So if this occurs, if it needs to move forward, the RO staff would seek and receive approval from the board to continue the process and to keep it moving forward and not to remand it. But a remand to the stakeholder process, one other detail, sometimes stakeholder processes and initiatives have multiple elements. So maybe people agree, maybe entities agree on one element, but really disagree on another one. So this remand could apply to the full initiative or just a part if it's severable. So if you had multiple elements, the staff could use their discretion based on the voting and stakeholder feedback and comments to decide what level or group of elements on which to do the voting and what to remand. Go on to the next slide. So the next tool is an elective remand. So if the RO staff is poised to make a recommendation that is counter to the recommendation from the stakeholder vote, or the RO board is poised to make a decision that's counter to the recommendation from the stakeholder vote, they could elect to send the issue back to the stakeholder process to try to address their concerns before actually conducting the vote. So rather than just saying we disagree with the stakeholder vote, we're going to reject it, they can say, here's our concerns that we would be voting, we would likely vote against this. Can you please go back and try to rework this? So that gives an elective remand to the board or staff. And of course, the board also has the flexibility to choose to send an issue back to the stakeholder process if it doesn't meet the automatic remand criteria. So in situations like that, maybe where they're opposing it or where it just doesn't seem like the solution that's coming forward is something that they support. So it continues to give the board that flexibility in discretion. All right, so finally, the elective override. So this would essentially be there's opposition, the stakeholder majority opinion, say the stakeholder majority opinion supports, and the staff or board decides that a proposal should move forward anyway, notwithstanding that, if they oppose, notwithstanding that opposition. So that would be an override of a stakeholder vote against. What we're recommending is that should be based, what we would say is that should really be based on consideration of the board's responsibility for the markets. They could provide an explanation they should provide an explanation for the decision that might include overriding concerns like protecting consumer interests, addressing some time critical circumstances, or just mitigating impacts on a particular region or group of entities, basically providing some background to stakeholders and information on why they're overriding that majority opinion and moving it forward with a different decision. There are some cases as well where we're recognizing that the RO staff may present a recommendation to the board which doesn't align with the stakeholder recommendation. And the RO board would be the final arbiter, of course, of approving an override recommended by the staff and ultimately making that final decision in the vote. at different stages. Like we mentioned, there are stages where the vote is advisory to the RO staff, not to the board. The RO staff could be delegated authority from the board to reach that judgment on its own. So rather than always having to go to the board, there may be cases where the board delegates to the RO staff to make a decision. Of course, again, with the staff or the board providing explanation to the stakeholders of why that decision was made. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the voting information, I'll just go through this really quickly given time. I mentioned there would be a tabulated report of underlying votes and that would be transparent. So that would include information about stakeholder characteristics. So we've got some potential tabulations here, but we're looking for suggestions as well. So for the sake of time, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just to wrap up, areas for stakeholder feedback. We are looking for feedback and reactions on overall the voting structure. So all of the elements of this, including how the sectors vote, the individual votes, stage gates, these remands, particularly that last slide, the voting tabulation and transparency of voting. What other characteristics are important to note? And if there are any other areas during the process where a vote or comments would be. Sorry, I sped up through those last ones, just trying to get us back close to time. So look forward to hearing your feedback in the next segment. Thanks.
Thank you, Allie. I think you did an excellent job of getting us back on track. Really great job. So here we are to our Q&A portion. And I know we've seen quite a number of hands go up. So ready to start taking those questions.
Thanks, Pam. And just briefly before we get into the raised hands, we will have 2 opportunities for questions and comments in these next 20 to 25 minutes. Would really like to keep this to sort of clarifying questions, things about the presentation that didn't make sense or you want to like understand a little bit better. And then the latter half of our discussion after our break will be more of the opportunity for like, well, I think maybe this could be different, or this feels hard, or this feels great. So let's try to do clarifying questions now, and then we'll move on to some more commentary in the latter half of our discussion. So yeah, we'll start taking hands, and then I know Serena's also going to put a Slido link in the chat if you'd prefer to put your questions in that way. Alan.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. Can we go to slide 42? I think I had a similar question to Kathleen. Actually, I think I had the same question, just kind of from the opposite end. So when we look at this voting, like where we take votes, and like how those votes move us on to the next part of the process, it seems like what we're saying now is that the votes aren't really advisory; they're really a necessary step. Can you clarify, or if a vote fails, can the RO staff still just move along and like override the vote?
Allie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. There are, in the, I guess further down in the slide, when I was talking about the remand and the overrides, there are situations where the RO staff would be able to override if they had strong justification and significant reasons for doing that. I guess if you go down a few slides, not to spend too much time on it, keep going down to the elective remand or elective override, yeah. Oh, sorry, back one, yep. So if there were like overriding concerns that they had, the examples we've listed are protecting consumer interests, addressing time critical circumstances, or mitigating undue impacts on a particular like region or group of entities, that there would be an opportunity for an override. I think what we want to make sure is that the vote doesn't become meaningless, that there's still meaning to the vote, and therefore if there is an override, that there is strong justification and a clear process and understanding of why and how that override happened. Understanding that there may be cases where it needs to take place.
I see. That's helpful.
Does that help? Okay.
Yeah. One additional thing though, at the roadmap process phase before the initiative goes to the RO board, how is that vote advisory? Because it seems like there's no one to override anything at that point.
Yeah, that's advisory to the RO. I mean, basically to the RO board at that point, if I'm understanding the question right, because they're voting on the road. The stakeholders are voting on the roadmap before it gets recommended to the RO board. So the stakeholder vote is giving a support or oppose as information to the RO board for the proposed roadmap that they would receive. Spencer, do you want to, I see your hand is up. I'm guessing you don't have a question, but if you want to chime in, go for it. Spencer.
Thanks, Allie. Spencer Gray with NIPSI. Alan, to your question and a bit to Kathleen's too, I think the last bullet on this slide addresses a bit of an open issue. Does it make sense in any and every instance for the RO board to have to be the final arbiter of staff wanting to override where stakeholders are, or could that be delegated to staff more programmatically or not? So I think some feedback on that from stakeholders would be useful. We didn't come down with a hard recommendation here.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just going to go in order. Kathleen.
Thank you, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you just confirm you can hear me, Neha?
I can, but you are a little bit soft.
Okay, here, let me try. Let me know if you can't hear me, but hopefully I'm louder. So my question for you is that I'm struggling to parse out what is status quo versus what is changing in the presentation, other than the voting. But in the whole process piece of this presentation, when I raised my hand the first time, I don't know if the paper has that breakdown clearly, but I would ask the group to go back and try to provide something that more clearly identifies what you think is the change that adds a value add, and what you, as well as what you think you're removing from the stakeholder process that has been detrimental. It's just very difficult to crosswalk because most of what you talked through is already happening. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, Kathleen, I appreciate that question, and I recognize that there is a lot of similarity with what is going on today. I mean, I think there are components of the stakeholder process that are consistent across. I mean, there are just components of the stakeholder process that are going to exist regardless of the nuances or details of how an idea, a concept gets from idea into tariff language. We weren't trying to necessarily start with the current CAISO process. I think we really appreciate the work that GridWorks did to do a pretty comprehensive evaluation of all of the different stakeholder processes that are currently in place for the different RTOs across the US, as well as the Markets Plus process, including the CAISO process, and then really take stakeholder feedback around getting the balance between stakeholder driven and flexibility right. And that is what this is the proposal we came to. I don't think we intend it to be a modification of the current proposal, but something that really, or the current CAISO process, but something that really stands as a package itself. And I don't know that we are fully equipped to actually go back and do that kind of crosswalk. I think we would rather evaluate this comprehensively. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you were done. That's really helpful context. As you walked through it, it did not come out to me that that was your process. So just feedback, it really does come out as you took the process and made a couple modifications. So I appreciate you framing it this way, that that's not what you did. I'm sure it's just, you know, bias and background, and that's what y'all know. So that's what you came up with something that looks like you did that process that I thought you did. So if you didn't do that process that way, and it was just all inception, totally respect that. You don't need to flip a new product. So thanks for clarifying. Can you try to unpack on this call what you think what kind of efficiencies you think is in here that will make this stakeholder process feasible. It's one of the questions you're asking for feedback on. I'm struggling to figure out what that feedback is. So if you could help unpack that now, that would be useful.
The feasibility of working through these different components.
Yeah, the feasibility for a market participant to engage in this process. What are the things that you think about your proposal and it helps to balance that load?
So I think what we're trying to do is really find that right balance around stakeholder engagement, as well as being able to drive initiatives efficiently towards conclusion in a timely manner. And I mean, you're right. Like we are actually asking for feedback around whether stakeholder participation in this framework is feasible. And while I think what we've heard from these calls and from the comments that we've received back is that there's a perspective on the value, particularly around the workshop process, that lets stakeholders really chew on an issue, really understand the underlying data behind a problem, and engage in a more deep conversation with the RO about what is driving a problem, especially when there isn't consensus on the solution. The challenge we've heard about that process is that it can sometimes feel like it gets stuck. And so we're trying to balance that with the stakeholder kind of co-chair or sector leads on some of these working group processes, that opportunity for those stakeholders who are deeply committed to seeing a change within these areas to help partner with the RO to drive that process forward so that we're not getting stuck in some of the kind of iterative loops that stakeholders have identified as a challenge for the current working group process. Once we get there, I think we're moving towards something that looks a lot like the process today, where stakeholder engagement reflects showing up based on your organizational perspective and continuing to empower staff of the RO to be the driver behind moving that process forward and to carrying the heavy lift of taking a more comprehensive concept and moving it through those straw proposal iterations. I think that's where we continue to see that feedback where stakeholders are maybe like, that's really, I think, that balance that you're talking about around staffing responsibility or opportunity, is that there's a different burden to market participants and other stakeholders from participating in a initiative process to represent their organization's viewpoint on a proposal, where the RO employees are the ones who can continue to take that feedback and those initiatives and drive it forward, and do the lifting of the drafting and the drafting of the documentation, compared to a more stakeholder driven proposal where it is up to stakeholders to actually do the drafting of this language. And so I think that's the balance that we're trying to find. But again, I think we are seeking that kind of feedback around if that is the right balance that gets the resource need right, with the opportunity to have more of a stakeholder based voice in certain areas.
My last question is, what I heard in this presentation was a proposal to add voting, but then to also keep the practice of requiring comments. Can you please clarify if that is your intent, or if you had a different intent in what you wanted to present?
Yes. No. So one of the things that we really heard is the importance of comments, that a vote is yes or no. There's no gray area to a vote. but that the comments are what is necessary for understanding why that vote took place. And the comments are necessary for helping to find the areas of consensus and the areas of disagreement. And if those areas, the comments are what illuminates divergence between market participants or stakeholders around how to move a proposal forward. So the comments continue to be, I think, a very important tool to both RO staff and the board around understanding where stakeholders are, and not just a black and white support oppose, but some of the nuance on why. And I think we've seen across many of the different initiatives over the last few years where board members have engaged in the comments to really help inform their perspective on a potential tariff change, and that value continues to be front and center, so that the policy guidance that the board is empowered to provide can have the kind of nuanced understanding and information from stakeholders about what specifically is driving either support or opposition to a particular initiative, and especially to aspects of that initiative.
I recognize this isn't the time for like opinions, but I do see comments and voting as substitutes, not complements. And this seems like a very workable option maybe for a utility. And I hope that you'll consider other market participants' needs.
Looking forward to your comments. They're always very helpful.
Thanks, Kathleen. And yes, there will be other additional discussion time after our break for additional opinions and commentary. Let's move on to Mary Winkie.
Hello, good morning. This is Mary Winkie with the Public Generating Pool. I had several clarifying questions about the sector, the sector identification. One question was with regards to kind of how, assuming in this future, the CAISO kind of market operator is separated from the CAISO BA, kind of where the CAISO BA fits into one of these sectors, if the CAISO BA is sort of functionally an EDAM entity in the future and is participating as an EDAM entity. And then I also had a question about the transmission dependent utility sector. It seems like there might be a pretty significant diversity within that sector on the types of entities who would fall into that sector. And there is a carve out, or not a carve out, but a specific seat for CCAs. And I'm just wondering why there would be a specific seat for CCAs and not other types of transmission dependent utilities. And then lastly, in thinking through kind of the diversity of these sectors geographically and kind of business types, the one sector that seems to stick out as maybe not having as much geographic diversity is the ISO PTO sector. And in some ways that sector may be more akin to a transmission dependent utility versus the kind of its own sector. So I think generally just feedback, there could be some additional rationale provided about the decision making around the proposed sectors. But I did have kind of those specific questions of clarification today.
Meg, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So I'll go one by one. So the first question was whether and where the CAISO as a BA entity would fit within the sector framework. And others on the working group can jump in, but I think that is an open question. It is something that we have discussed, but have not reached a definitive perspective on. My own view is that if the ISO is a BA participant or a BA entity participating in the market, there should be representation there. I think it would be interesting to get stakeholder input on where that interest would fit. I'll stop there to see if anyone else wants to weigh in from the working group on that. Okay. The second question was, I think we touched on this with one of the questions during my presentation, but it was asking about the composition of the TDU sector and sort of why the specific call out for CCAs. Again, I think my take on that is the same as mentioned previously, which is that they represent sort of a unique business model within that group. At least that was how we saw that sort of subset of entities within the TDU sector, and thought that for that reason, it would make sense to expand the TDU sector to include an additional seat for that entity grouping. Mary, was there another piece of the question on the TDU sector? I know you asked about the PTOs.
Yeah, I think my last question was just about the PTOs and the diversity there, and whether or not the PTOs are sort of more aligned with kind of to me, maybe a different. I'm almost thinking about sort of the transmission dependent utilities as like sort of large and small, maybe versus one big category, but I'm thinking, just trying to think through that. That's why I wanted that explanation.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and I myself had not thought about it in quite that way. I think my answer would be that the PTOs within the CAISO are somewhat uniquely situated relative to other EIM entities, and that they have transferred operational control of their transmission facilities to the CAISO. And I think they function a little bit differently than a transmission dependent utility. I suspect there would be some concern with transitioning the CAISO PTOs into the TDU sector, again, because of some of the distinctions in how they interact with the ISO and their role within the CAISO footprint.
I might just add, I mean, this proposal here is very like a functional proposal rather than a business model proposal. I think that's an open area for feedback on the sectors. This is more similar to the approach that we have today. And I think see a lot of value in having that functional role continue through from a sector perspective, but I think that is something that we're open for. And I do think it's important on the CCA question to note in the number of seats that that we are adding seats to those sectors that are particularly diverse to reflect that those diverse voices and ensure that those diverse voices all have a role or a seat to be able to articulate that diversity. And so I think it's not just the reservation, but recognizing that there are different numbers of seats allocated to these sectors to support that diversity.
Thanks, Pam and Meg, for your responses. I recognize that there's a number of hands up. I see 5. I also know that we're a bit behind on our agenda and don't want to skip our break. So I think it'll serve everyone. So I'm going to make note of the hands that are up. I'm going to suggest that we take just a 5-minute break instead of a 10-minute break, since there seems to be a lot of good questions. And I'll come and revisit the hands that are up afterward. So I have that it's 45. And so folks could come back at 50. So that's either 10:50, 11:50, or 12:50, depending on where you are. And I see Karinia, Vijay, James, and Julie. I see your hands, and you'll be first in line when we come back. Thanks, folks. All right, hello again, folks. Welcome back. We will continue with clarifying questions, and then as promised, we will get into some time for some more discussion, opinion, feedback like that, but want to make sure our clarifying questions get resolved first. So I have 4 folks in line, and then I also have a question from Slido that I'll pose. But Karinia, we'll start with you if you are online.
I am online, thank you. Turning on my video. Thank you for all this. And I have 2 that I think are just pure clarifying questions, and maybe one you might want to sort of punt to later. But on a stakeholder, I don't know that you guys have ever defined who is a stakeholder. Is it anybody who walks in off the street, or is it somebody who has a stake in the success of the RO in some way? So I just give that to you as a suggestion to define that at some point if you haven't already, and if I missed it, I will read it in the document when I read the document. Second is around this issue of emergent operational issues. I think there had been a lot of discussion in the various meetings around fast tracking, this concept of fast tracking. I see that you kept this idea of an emergent operational issue. Can you clarify whether it is open to stakeholders to suggest an emergent operational issue, or whether it is staff only? And that's my clarifying question. And then the third is around this idea of the RO staff being able to override stakeholders. I think there's probably everybody on this phone sort of believes in the concept of checks and balances, as well as ensuring the fact that the staff is doing their job correctly. But was there any consideration or discussion given to the idea of stakeholders having 205 filing rights at FERC in a situation when the RO staff has overridden stakeholders? So I think, that's a 205 versus a 206, which is obviously an easier filing at FERC than a 206, which is much more cumbersome and difficult. So my suggestion is specifically, if the RO staff is overriding, to allow stakeholders of rights to 205 filings in that circumstance. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so the first question was on the definition of a stakeholder, correct?
Yes.
So our definition is pretty broad. We have suggested these different groups of stakeholders. And maybe Meg, if you want to jump in here at any point, I'd welcome your support here. But I think we're not trying, one of the things that we heard back from this group or as part of this process was the value of having an open process where there wasn't a limitation or a restriction or a registration obligation in order to participate in that stakeholder process. And so we're trying to keep that pretty broad to enable really maximum participation in these initiatives, while also providing some definition to what a stakeholder is. And I see Meg has her hand up, and so I'll let her take over with the more detailed answer.
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely agree with that, Pam. And I think your point that what we have now is highly, I'll say, decentralized, and it is a process that is kind of open to all comers. I think our thought with the sector framework, retaining and refining that concept, was a way of providing some organization around stakeholder participation, but the intent was to continue to have a broad process that would enable hopefully the same or even expanded degrees of stakeholder participation by all types of entities. And so there really wasn't a desire to sort of define the concept of what is a stakeholder in a way that would leave parties with relevant interests outside the process.
And is there a limitation on voting then? Can anyone vote?
So the concept that Ally discussed was that there would be sort of a stakeholder, and we have not developed this document yet, but kind of a stakeholder code of conduct, or kind of a minimum set of criteria and level of commitment to participate in the process. The thought was not that that would be a financial commitment, but that it would be more of a commitment to constructively engage.
Okay.
But the intent was not to create sort of hurdles around
Okay.
participation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then your second question was, where could emergent operational issues come from? That one is open again to all stakeholders. We didn't put any restrictions on the origination of any of these kinds of stakeholder initiatives, but just some categorization about kind of where they fall into. So again, that's open to a nomination by any of the different stakeholders or participants in the market. And then to your third question, I believe
Sorry, clarification
Spencer.
on that.
Okay,
So
go ahead.
in essence, this emergent operational concept is if it's an emergent operational issue, in essence, it's sort of acting as a fast track. Is that a bit sort of like,
Yes.
yeah, okay, all right. So
we did hear, I think, pretty extensively that one of the things that was really valued in the CAISO process compared to some other processes was the ability to nimbly respond to things that emerged in the market, and to be able to have that more nimble response was something that many stakeholders identified as a priority in our proposal. And we see this as a way to preserve that nimbleness in the market design process or the stakeholder process.
okay, great, thank you.
And then I believe Spencer is on point to address your question around 205 rates.
Yeah, good question on 205 rates. Where we've gone as a group, both in the launch committee level and then in the work group level for stakeholdering, we've really concentrated the question of a dispersion or vesting of 205 rights in the RO board level. So a board level vesting of the CAISO's current 205 rights. In our judgment, it has not made sense to us to suggest vesting those in a stakeholder committee or stakeholders sort of writ large. It seems as though many stakeholders appreciate the flatness of the CAISO as a place to interact. And I think that's one reason Meg referred to this already in terms of still making it easy to participate. So we haven't leaned into a membership style model for what we've presented here this morning. And similarly on 205 rights, we've taken the lesson that having a market operator who is still able to execute on policies and go in front of FERC and not be sort of stuck in some of the gridlock that I would say characterizes PJM in particular, is probably the poster child for a membership-driven stakeholder approach with 205 rights held by both transmission owners and effectively by a membership committee. That has made it harder to get things through to FERC. And so we've not made a recommendation to change that, to disperse the 205 rights into stakeholders. And I would say that holds true obviously for the CAISO today, but it also is true even for the experience of many of us in the West in Markets Plus through SPP. While that's a much different and more committee and voting based approach, the 205 rights still are held by SPP as a corporation still. So we haven't suggested broaching that here for the RO.
And what about in the one circumstance where the staff is overriding? I mean, I understand you're saying it's a blanket statement that, to no 205, but you also have this RO staff override scenario. So I was just simply focused on that one scenario.
So I as I mentioned a little bit ago, I think that is an open question we'd like stakeholder feedback on. Does it make sense for the RO staff to have that override option at that stage gate in the stakeholdering process as something delegated to them to do by the RO board? Or in any case where the RO staff is inclined to override the stakeholder views, should the RO board have to be the final arbiter of that or not?
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Cornelia, for your questions, and Pam and Spencer for the responses. Vijay, welcome back. Glad you were able to join. Go ahead.
Thank you. I hope you guys can hear me. Vijay Satyal, Western Resource Advocates, Markets and Transmission. This is really good stuff. Thank you so much to this work group for putting some really good ideas on paper and presenting. I'll be in full transparency. I was able to attend Pam's, Brian's, Josh's updates. And after that, I had to drop off for a conflict. So I have two clarifying questions. One proposal, which I know Pam and our consultant, Elaine Kinoche, is aware of, and even maybe Kathleen, but I will put it into the comments. But let me start with the clarifying questions first. There are three of them. First is for Brian. In the issue identification stage, and if we went to that one detailed slide that breaks down the issue identification or whichever it was, you referred to, I'm not meaning you personally, I meant you referred to something about if it's a non-emergency or non-reliability kind of initiative or issue, it may go down the conceptual or the discretionary path. I didn't know what was conceptual meant by. There was reference to a conceptual path, and I didn't know what that meant. So that's question one. And I'll just throw my second clarifying question out now, and that's for Josh. In the second phase, where stakeholder initiatives and the recommendation or idea is for a sector to sponsor, caveat, sometimes the data owning utilities or TOUs have more knowledge and insight than, say, we, the PIOs or clean energy advocates or trade allies who may not have full visibility. So I hope you're not restricting sectoral partnership in sponsoring a issue. And it doesn't have to be one sector carries the weight to justify it. And the budget constraint is a priority going to stop if it reaches a budget limit? So is each issue being proposed being tagged with a budget dollar amount all the way? So these are my two clarifying questions. Then I have one main comment or question.
Thanks, Vijay. Let's go with your clarifying questions first, and then if I can ask you to hold your comment until a bit later in the discussion.
Oh, my third is a main question as well, specific to that visual flow chart, but thank you.
So I think so your first question was who can be a sector sponsor of a workshop?
Well, no, first, yeah, I guess is it limited to be a particular sector? It shouldn't be. What if 2 or 3 sectors agree on an issue and they come together? So the way I heard and watched these slides, it made it look like if it's a stakeholder-led initiative, a sector sponsor has to be behind it. What if a certain sector has changes 2-3 months down the road, but another sector feels equally the same about it and they want to partner in that? I assume that's not an issue. I don't know if that was a semantic interpretation I had.
I mean, so our goal here was that more than one sector wanted to invest heavily in leading that issue. So what our concept here is, one of the things that we've heard is that it's important to have opportunities for stakeholders to genuinely drive market changes and market policy. We also have heard that the challenge with the current process is that there are some times when the working group is stuck in a little bit of a spin and it's not getting that stakeholder support to move it forward. So the idea here was that this would create a little bit of a framework to have more, really have sectors say, to really genuinely raise their hand and say, I want to work on this. And that could be open to any member of that sector.
any member company or any individual in that sector, not just the representative who's on the SRC, but to any participant in that sector could say, I'm really interested in, say, greenhouse gas policy. I want to partner in this work group. And then to have that happen at least twice, so that there are stakeholders who are willing to be the drivers behind that engagement with the RO, that there's a partnership there so that we don't get stuck in kind of this the spin that we've heard is some of the feedback on that process, but to continue to have that support. I do think we have to have flexibility to allow people to tag in and out.
Sure.
We have job changes and promotions and opportunities, and we have to always accommodate that. So I think there's flexibility there as long as we can continue to have that support from, a diverse group of sector representatives. And I think, again, always open to your feedback on how this framework looks. We're starting with a proposal. We are asking again for your feedback on whether we got it right and how we could make it better.
Perfect. And I'll skip my second, the earlier question, but I'll just ask my main one question is, in this entire visual that I saw with the map, is there any thought about the new RO structure incorporating some of the improvements that the EIM governing body did make with the market advisor, the market expert kind of role? What if there's an advisory opinion from the market expert that identifies any issues? And is there a pathway for that to be influencing the prioritization of an initiative or an issue? Was that ever did that ever come up in your deliberations? And is there a role for that? Because that's separate from the role of the DMM. So just a question / curiosity. Thank you.
I think that one of the foundational principles of our proposal here is that an initiative can come from any source. And the market advisor is a source of initiative. So yes, I think it's hard to list out everything comprehensively, but MSC, DMM, all of these are broadly defined as stakeholders. And I think the proposal here is that when we're doing that road mapping process, that ideas or recommendations can come from any source.
Thank you. To save time, I will let you all know that I have some ideas around the stage 1 issue evaluation and working group formations. We'll submit that in our comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
all.
Thanks, Vijay. James.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good morning. This is Jim Shetler. I'm the general manager for the Balancing Authority in Northern California and also on the launch committee. I have a couple of clarifying questions. Maybe these are primarily for Meg. First one, Meg, on the EDAM sector, I note you say one representative. Is it safe for me to assume, similar to what we've discussed for the RIF, that as EDAM participation expands, we would likely see an expansion on the number of seats for the EDAM entities?
Yeah, Jim, that's exactly right. We've talked about that, and there's been recognition that there may need to be realignment at some future point, just depending on how EDAM participation evolves.
Excellent. And then secondly, the RO governance work group had a comment about creating a sector for advanced technologies. And I believe if I look at the list here, that's probably what is combined under distributed energy resources. And I'm just wondering whether this group had any discussion about a separate sector for advanced technologies or not.
Yeah, that's
Brian,
can I come to Brian on that? Thanks.
We have, and I would welcome feedback on that. Really, as I and my outreach to my sector has resulted in, DERs and the description of enabling technologies under this category really encompass the vast majority of those that would not otherwise be represented in a sector here. And so some of the advanced technologies, advanced generation, advanced transmission technologies may be encompassed by the sectors that use those technologies, IPPs, independent transmission developers in this case, so or other transmission owners. So I would love some feedback on that, additional views. That's where we came down at this point.
All right, thank you for that. And then maybe just a comment at some point. I know the RO governance work group will need to have some discussion with the stakeholder work group on how these sectors may or may not relate to the nominating committee process. But we'll save that for another day. And then just out of curiosity, to what extent has the work group had any dialogue with the ISO on the proposal and gotten any feedback from them on the proposal?
So we are continuing to have ongoing conversations with the ISO. I don't think have direct feedback from them, but continue to have those conversations, especially as we're, I think just getting this proposal out for review, but continue to really appreciate the ISO's support and engagement to answer especially our clarifying questions, but more opportunity there to dialogue as we get clarity on feedback and the sector feedback that we'll see here to go forward.
Okay, thank you. And I'll have a comment later on when we get into those. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Julie.
Thank you, Neha. This is Julie Halligan. I'm with the Public Advocate's Office in California, and we could actually go back to that last screen. In looking at the sector composition and the sector seats, we observe that if you compare supply side sectors with demand side sectors, the demand side sectors are at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. So, for example, you could say that demand side sectors could include the consumer advocates like us, the PIOs, maybe large commercial and industrial, and possibly transmission dependent utilities. But even so, even with that group, you'd get to 4 sectors, while the supply side sectors, which I kind of would assume are the others, comprise 6. So this situation is kind of the same if you're comparing seats on the sectors. We'd end up with 5 for demand versus 10 for the supply side there. So the question that we're having here is, how will the SRC ensure that its proposals are representing the public interest if load and supply are not balanced here in voting, and if profit maximizing or rent seeking, whatever you want to call it, entities have a strong built-in advantage in this structure?
Meg.
Yeah, Julie, just speaking candidly, I don't think we sharpened our pencils to try and identify equivalencies along those particular lines. And just speaking solely for myself, I had a little bit of trouble following the numbers that you were laying out there. I think it might be interesting to take a look at perhaps a comment that outlines that. I think we were trying to look at where there were common interests among stakeholder entities, and we weren't necessarily trying to achieve particular equivalencies. But if you have specific suggestions, I think we could take a look at that and consider them.
Thank you. Yeah, we'd be happy to comment on that.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Meg. And yes, as a reminder, there will be an opportunity for written comments after this. Colin.
Hi, this is Colin Smith from LEAP. I was wondering if you could clarify sort of the interaction between the seats on the SRC and the voting process. Specifically, my understanding is sectors have 1 vote per sector. And so what exactly does additional seats on the SRC kind of provide to a sector? Is it just more representation in terms of the process of setting up that voting, or are there other I guess benefits of having more seats?
Can I take that one? Yeah. So I think there are a couple of considerations here. One is that having sort of a seat or more or fewer seats within a sector was the intent was really to try and capture some baseline level of common interest among sector participants. So that was the intent. It wasn't sort of the intent. And looking at a couple of the sectors that currently are particularly large, trying to make sure that there was comparable representation in terms of the number of representatives there relative to the number of participants in the sector. So there was that. And then I think another consideration is that, as was outlined in the discussion of the stakeholder process, there is a expanded role for the SRC at different inflection points throughout the stakeholder process, up to and including having stakeholders participate in sponsorship and of an initiative and kind of managing the workshop process. So there's more work for the SRC to do than under the current framework. And in order for that work to be accomplished effectively, there is some need to expand the SRC in terms of numbers of representatives relative to what we have now. So that was part of the consideration as well. So we were trying to seek alignment with entities that have sort of common interests and also recognize that there's a need to expand the stakeholder body relative to the status quo.
Thank you, Meg. All right, Kamaya.
Hi, I have a handful of what I think are truly clarifying questions whose answers are probably self-evident, but I'll just clarify. An entity that is part of EDAM would be in the EDAM entity sector, even though, it's also an EIM entity. That's question one. Question two is to confirm that no entity can be in more than one sector. Question three is about this consumer advocates sector. Given that large CNI customers have their own sector, is it sort of imagined that consumer advocates is representing residential customers and, for instance, environmental interests, as opposed to other sorts of consumers?
So I can take the first couple of questions and then might seek input from others on the third. But yes, I think the intent was that if an entity is a participant in EDAM, that they participate in that sector and sort of not retain membership in the EIM entities sector. And we also did not include in our proposal any kind of concept where people could participate in two sectors. But again, I think the purpose of this structure is to try and encourage collaboration between sectors and among stakeholder participants as a whole. So there are obviously areas of organic alignment, and there's nothing to prevent two sectors from coordinating with one another on a particular initiative. Is there anyone who can take the particular question on the overlap between large CNI customers and the consumer advocates?
Sure. If Michelle is on, I welcome your perspective here too. But really just to first answer that question, the consumer advocate sector represents those consumer advocates that are created through state statute to represent residential and small consumers in utilities within that state. And so that's a more lengthy definition than we can fit on the slide, but is in our materials.
I'm just going to unmute myself and respond and agree with what Pam said. But I want to clarify that who the state designated consumer advocates represent is slightly different from state to state. Many represent small commercial and residential, a few only residential, a few the full set, but it's the state designation that creates the category.
Can I chime in here too? I just want to, I think it's worth flagging that I think the intent here was to come up with some sectors that have some pretty definite distinction from one another. I think we wanted to balance the distinctive perspectives of these sectors, also recognizing that there's going to be a lot of distinctive views and perspectives within those sectors, and we're hoping that there can be a lot of collaboration and view sharing within those. I also think we're intending that for those people, organizations who want to be stakeholders in this process, that they are in many ways self-selecting their sectors. My organization identifies with this sector, and that's where I'm going to be able to log my votes into. That's where I'm going to be engaging in these conversations. So I think the idea was that these categories here are pretty high level, and that there is lots of diversity and lots of ways to sort of characterize the organizations that are within these sectors, so that there's some fluidity. There's going to be a lot of organizations that that may be able to fit within multiple sectors, and you're going to have to pick one and go with that, at least for some period of time. I think we had included maybe you can't change sectors any more frequently than once a year or something like that. But I think it's important to recognize that there has to be some fluidity in here. And what we really want feedback on is this the right number? Is this the right, are these the right categories? Knowing that these are intended to be relatively broad categories for these individual sectors.
Thanks, Kathleen. And just want to share one comment that we got via Slido. I think this is less of something to be clarified here, but maybe something to be included in a subsequent draft. But if the group could include expected timelines for stage 1 and 2, or examples, including timelines of how different initiatives would move through the whole process, seems like that might help people understand the proposed process a bit better.
So I think it's a really great clarifying question and a point. And I think we get a little bit into this in our white paper, but that's I think a very challenging proposition due to the different kinds of scope that an initiative might have. And we've seen, I think, a lot of divergence in the timelines for these different working groups or even stakeholder initiatives. I mean, if you look at something like the extended day ahead market and day ahead enhancements, that has been in the works and under consideration for many years. And an initiative of that size and scope will take years to come to fruition compared to something like the price formation bidding above $1,000 for hydro and storage resources, which is pretty discrete and requires much more minor tariff clarifications that took about 4 to 6 months. And so I think while that's a great question, and I think that again feeds back into some of Vijay's questions around the cost scoping of this, that all of these different priorities require a balancing act, and that it's very hard to, it's nearly impossible to say the RO will undertake 6 initiatives every year, because that one initiative might be anything from the extended day ahead market or resource adequacy enhancements all the way to the price formation issues that were relatively minor. And so it's, I think, trying to get the right balance between engagement and stakeholder input into how much stakeholders want the RO to take on, how, and of course, that all of those initiatives require staff to not only support the initiative process, but to do the technical programming and implementation as well. And so there's a balance, there's a cost and speed transfer that we have to consider. And so I think where it would be, where I understand where that question is coming from, it's really a question around what are the stakeholders prioritizing? What is the scope of that, that suite of initiatives? And giving the balance to say, if stakeholders are prioritizing, say, 2 major initiatives, can we also add a couple, small initiatives in that mix to get a full portfolio, but to look at these as a portfolio approach rather than a discrete number of things that will be undertaken on any given year.
Thanks, Pam. All right, so we have just about 35 minutes left together today. And I want to make sure we have a little bit of time at the end to figure out next steps. Sarah, if I could ask you to move to slide 60. Oh, you're already there. Great. Oh no, a couple more forward. All right. So I'm going to spend just about maybe 10 minutes on each of these next couple of questions. Here, and again, we have an opportunity for you to provide your answer in Slido if you're more comfortable with that. Zoom chat's also fine. But I'd invite you to reflect on which aspects of the discussion document you're most comfortable with. Another way to think about this might be what parts of the discussion document are working for you. I know it was a lot of material to absorb, so maybe I'll offer up a couple of our other discussion questions as well. So invite you to continue reflecting on which aspects of the discussion document you feel most comfortable with. Also invite comments on which parts of the discussion document you feel challenged by. And if you have suggestions for things that would make the discussion document stronger. Yes, Fred.
Yeah, hi, everybody. It's Fred here at Northwest Energy Coalition. First, I just want to recognize the phenomenal amount of work that you all have done here. And to say, overall, I think it's really, really good. But I also have to say it's a lot to absorb. And so my first recommendation is, I think there's a lot of really good content in the presentation here. As this moves toward adoption into kind of a terms of reference or, a document that, we refer to for how this process works, I would recommend separating this into one part that really outlines the requirements of the process in a relatively simple form. And then a lot of the descriptive material here can be pulled into a kind of a supplement, a guidance because otherwise I think what's going to happen is we're all going to be, especially staff, but all of us will be looking at whatever it is and combing through it, looking for, okay, here are the things we got to do, or the things we, if we're participating as stakeholders, what we have to do and what we have to anticipate for the process. It's way too much to absorb as a single document. So I just think separating it a bit, not, you know, you can be in one document, but separate it into a section that really describes the basic elements of the process. And for example, specifically when voting is required, or and for what purpose, I think that would be very helpful. So we have a much smaller thing to look at in terms of making sure that the you know, that the kind of internal compliance, you know, for what's being done comports with the overall process that's being laid out here. I'm not sure if I said that very well, but that's kind of where I'm going with it. The second thing is on voting, and I know we're going to have more discussion on this. It's going to be an ongoing thing. I think that voting should be, but let me back up and just say the stakeholder initiative process is a commitment of resources. It's a commitment of time, effort, attention, and money, you know, directly or indirectly. And in that sense, it has a lot of weight because it's the place where an organization that has a lot, that's going to have a lot of things going on, this is the place where stakeholders are directly engaging, you know, in a big way, and have an influence on how those resources, including their own, are going to be directed. So I get all the concerns and even a little bit of the anxiety about this process, but I think that we have a solid place to start from. The question for me gets back to how much voting and what for. And so I would lean in the direction of having, you know, in specific places when the SRC is recommending to the board on the full package, I think that's a clear place for having an indicative vote. But I think we would want to be cautious about throwing a vote at every little thing that comes up. To the extent that you can get maybe not entire consensus, but kind of a sense of the room that, or, you know, broadly speaking, including in hybrid meetings, all of us out here, that something is good enough. You know, I think that's the way we should think about operating this, and have voting be a backstop. It, you know, if necessary, a call, again, kind of division of the House type of call could be done, but not to specify voting in multiple places just because it sounds like it might be useful. So I hope I've conveyed that, because I think there is, somebody mentioned before, kind of the balanced approach here. I think we want a strong RO staff engagement and, you know, guidance for this stakeholder initiative process. We also want a strong stakeholder guidance in this process, and how to find the right balance and not to get overwhelmed with the process. And really, ultimately, I think this will work best if we have a process we can all trust, and we can only do that by actually engaging in it and improving it as we go along. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Fred. Really appreciate those comments and the recognition of the work that's gone into this proposal. I will note that we do have a white paper that is posted to the WEEB website, the landing page for the Pathways Initiative, that goes into some more of this detail. And again, I agree, this is a lot to absorb, but we are trying to create a proposal that hangs together and creates that balance together. The white paper is broken up into sections, and there are references within those sections. So I hope that if you haven't had a chance to review that, that it helps illustrate and illuminate some of the challenges that you've noted around absorbing all of this information at once. Yes, these slides have been very dense with very many words breaking PowerPoint convention. But I hope that maybe that white paper can help expand on some of the density here and provide some of that feedback. Again, I think the voting, I appreciate your comments on voting, and I think there consistent with where we tried to land with the launch committee. And I'd invite Allie if you want to come back and comment a little bit further on this. But there are, I think, some important points that we have laid out where we recommend that a vote is being taken, and other points where there's more optionality on that vote. I think some of what we've heard from stakeholders is that there's sometimes value in taking just a snap vote to help move an issue forward. If there's a lot of controversy or a couple folks who are engaged in that stakeholder process that have strong opinions, a vote is a tool that helps gauge whether those opinions are widely shared or whether those are strongly held minority opinions. And to include that as a potential tool to move forward was an important value for a number of folks who made comments through this workshop process. So again, please look at the white paper to get some more of that detail here. But again, I think we're trying to strike that balance that you articulated and looking for the feedback that we did get that balance right.
Well, my only response is I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks.
Allie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sorry, I was on mute. Double mute caught me. Yeah, I was just going to add one of the other things that we thought about was where in the processes that we've experienced, where there have been challenges that we thought would benefit from a vote. So like the problem statement, that's pretty early on, but we've seen that in some initiatives that can be an area where people struggle to get to alignment, or it can be hard to tell where everyone is. So we tried to think as well about like, where are there existing maybe times when it would be helpful to have a vote to be able to move something forward and to be able to convey and communicate whether there's agreement. So that was another lens that we applied to thinking about those triggers for a vote. But definitely interested in your feedback and appreciate your comments, Fred.
Thanks, Allie. Wanted to share a few comments that we received via Slido regarding aspects of the discussion document that folks felt comfortable with. So I think reflective of the conversation that just happened, we have a comment here that the collaborative process between the SRC and RO staff that can hopefully strike a dynamic balance that will change over time and by subject between workload and creative force handled by staff versus stakeholders. No one static balance will be right in all situations, and developing a collaborative culture, which can't be legislated, is really key. So I think that's really reflective of the commentary that we just had. Also, visibility of voting and associated comments to the RO board, sector autonomy on voting thresholds and selection of reps, etc. The policy prioritization process seems status quo and non-controversial. It's great. And then kudos to a creation of a specific stakeholder sector for DERs. So some of the aspects of the discussion document that folks are feeling comfortable with. Lauren, I see your hand is up.
Hi, yeah, this is Lauren Carr from Cal CCA. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm with Cal CCA, the trade association that represents the 24 community choice aggregators in California. And they serve over a third of the load in the CAISO BAA, and they're a little bit unique, like Meg mentioned, in that they don't own transmission and distribution. And given the discussion today in the clarification section, I just thought I'd maybe add a couple of comments and recommendations on the transmission dependent utility sector. Starting off, we greatly appreciate the document's inclusion of CCAs within the sectors and agree that CCAs, given their unique business model, don't really fit neatly into the existing RIF sectors. But given some of the discussion today, it seems worth more clearly defining the transmission sector. And we support what I think Jim mentioned earlier regarding coordinating the RO governance work group, which has defined the nominating committee sectors, including a sector for LSEs that don't own transmission or distribution, with the sector definitions in this working group. Also wanted to express openness to defining the seats within the sector. I think that was a suggestion from another stakeholder in the chat. But again, just want to give kudos for including a sector definition that includes CCAs, and looking forward to working on more clearly defining that sector.
Thanks, Lauren. I'll jump in. I agree with you that having heard some of the input on the TDU sector today, I think you're right that we need some more definition around that. And if stakeholders, including the Cal CCA team, would like to weigh in, I think that would be incredibly helpful.
All right, invite folks to continue to raise their hand and put comments in either the Zoom chat or in Slido. I will share a few in Slido in response to the question of which aspects of the discussion document do you feel most challenged by? We have one saying that the comments from Julie Halligan resonated with me. The voting structure is concerning because it underrepresents load residential customer and it's not enough to have protection of consumer interest in the charter and assume that the interests of consumers will be fully represented. They actually need to be represented structurally. Oftentimes at CAISO, load and consumer interests are not represented due to not having the resources to participate. So with fewer stakeholders in the room, the supplier's interests are louder because there are more. And it ends up swaying the opinion. Residential and small business customers that are the end-use consumers of energy from the markets are often minority stakeholder opinions, but they are the most impacted by decisions because they are the ones footing the bill. I have a few more to share, but wanted to pause there in case anyone from the work group wanted to respond.
Yeah, Neha, may I respond to
please.
that? I wanted to, and Julie raised the point originally, and now with this opportunity, I'd like to raise 2 points that I think are important to emphasize in regards to this. While I fully support this sentiment, I just wanted to note a couple of ways that we have tried to address this issue. So one is that there is not weighting amongst the sector votes, partially for this reason, that the votes, we're recording the votes of individual entities with other characteristics of those entities, such as load versus supply, consumer, and we're asking for feedback about what those characteristics are that we could record for each entity so that the data on votes could be sliced and diced different ways by the SRC, RO staff, and RO board. Secondly, each of the sectors then can characterize their votes, their opinions, and what it captures of consumer interest versus generation, et cetera. And so there's not a static weighting to those votes that has to be required to deliver an opinion to the board, but really it's more the board can evaluate that with a balancing according to the issue, according to the interests that they want to make sure are represented. So that's one. And then the other, speaking of structural representation, this is not part of our work group's work, but there is within the public interest work group a specific focus on how is that consumer interest writ large, public interest writ large, state and local interest, and then consumer interest specifically, and that's the state recognized consumer advocate committee that would exist that is being addressed by a separate work group. So that's just one reason that it's not represented or discussed in this paper and presentation as much.
Thank you, Brian. I really do appreciate your point there around the different work streams that we have, and centering on the public interest in the governance structure has been one of the foundational principles of the Pathways Initiative, which is why we do have a separate work group that is solely focused on the public interest. Again, I think as Fred noted, there's a lot of complexity here, and there's an intersection between all of our different working groups and a challenge to I think, pull those threads together here as we each working group has tried to present its own comprehensive proposal. But as we take your comments and feedback and go forward with our integrated proposal for that integrated approach to step 2 that will be published here in late September, I hope that these threads are what come together to create that overall centering for that public interest and get that balance right through all of the different levers and structures that we have available to us to really help get that balance right.
Thanks, Pam. Want to share a couple other comments from the Slido. So again, this is in response to aspects that feel challenging. Voting, the balance between accountability, binding votes, and flexibility and culture of collaboration, advisory voting. I understand the attraction of a binding vote, but worry it would be used to stymie minority interests, stymie progress, or raise legal risk. Would suggest more thought about things like the remand or override that create firmer ability for SRC to push forward. And then a couple others that are brief. Sector definition, seats reserved for California-only entities, CCA, CAISO PTOs, without equal representation from other states. And then finally, the broad discretion for RO staff and the board to override stakeholder voting, even when a remand is triggered. So don't know if anyone in the stakeholder process work group wants to respond to any of those. And I know we have a live comment in the room as well.
Yeah, I think we really do appreciate these pieces of feedback. Again, we're looking for balance, and we heard among stakeholders a reluctance to go towards that, definitive percentage-based weighted voting. And so without that weighted voting, we're trying to strike that balance of allowing that discretion and the transparency of the information received under the voting structures to be considered by the board, and to empower the board to understand and reflect on where stakeholders really are with an initiative without really getting into some of the structural frameworks that more of a formalized weighted voting would provide. So again, these are balances and trade-offs, and appreciate getting the feedback and the comments on how to get those checks and balances really right.
Thanks, Pam. Kyle, I think you are going to be our last comment of the day. So go ahead.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Kyle Novice with the Public Advocate's Office, the CPUC. I just want to respond to Brian's comment and clarifications. It was really helpful about the vote recording, and also some of what Pam just talked about. And it's just related to the voting. Pam, you had said definitive percentage weighted voting. Could you just clarify what you mean by that? And then one other question is there a reason that abstention was left out as an option for votes? And then I have just a couple other quick ones after that.
So I think what you see in some of the Eastern RTOs is where you have where stakeholders are first registered and pay some type of registration fee that then gives them a percentage of the overall stakeholder vote. So you could say, transmission provider A has 14,000 miles of transmission lines and 4% of the vote. That's, I think there was a reluctance to really go to getting that granular. And so when you aren't, there has to be some type of so the transparency around the tabulated voting. And again, I think please look at our white paper for the details that we couldn't really dive all the way into in our call today, but trying to get that, like the transparency around stakeholder support to inform the RO vote and to inform the RO board to help them make decisions that are in the overall interests of the market. And that that is the balance between really being able to have flexibility for, you know, one entity to have their own representation and their own direct advocacy. I liked Spencer's framework of the flat organization, and that flatness and direct engagement with RO staff and the direct engagement with the RO board is, I think, a counterbalance to having more of that rigid voting structure that you know, is forced to add up to 100%. So again, we're looking for feedback on how to get that balance and how to ensure that the right voices are being reflected in this process, but also asking that as we think through the different avenues that are available to different sectors and different market participants around the public interest and the stakeholder process and the organizational structure, that we're looking at this comprehensively across the different work streams that we have, so that the package as a whole is what is part of that balancing act.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's clear. And then just real quick, is there a reason abstention was left out? And then I'm just going to skip one question and ask one last one, which is just, is the idea that the code of conduct would prevent situations where you might have entities under the same parent company engaging and voting on issues, you know, kind of trying to prevent like crowding out votes within a sector?
Allie, do you want to talk about the role of abstentions?
Sure. You know, we didn't include in the proposal specifically abstentions, but I do imagine and votes that, you know, that's often an option. So that's a good suggestion of something to address. We did think about, if you're not there, that would just be not recorded as a vote, and it would be the sectors wouldn't require a certain quorum to move forward. It would be, if you vote, you vote, and if you don't, you're not included. But we'll think more about abstention and whether kind of intentional abstention is different than just not being present for the vote. So appreciate that comment. And then the code of conduct, we had really thought about that as I don't know if I'd describe it as like a soft requirement. It's a description of basically how, like it says, code of conduct, how you want and stakeholders to engage, what kind of, the fact that this is to be a collaborative and a collaborative environment where we're trying to support working towards solutions, with the intent that A, you've got people registered, and B, they, by agreeing to this code of conduct, understand and should have some support and agreement for what you're trying to accomplish, and that they're committing to not just throwing up barriers for the sake of that. So I think we need to do more thinking about what would be in that code of conduct. So definitely appreciate any comments, or if you have experience in other markets about things that have worked or not, that would be great to hear. Because that is an open discussion of what actually goes in there and what would work well. So thank you, appreciate your comments. And Spencer, you want to jump in and add something?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. Just to add on the last point, representing a sector that has a lot of complex business models and affiliates and subsidiaries, one thing we have talked about is wanting to make sure we're avoiding the ability to sort of strategically sector shop and to populate different sectors with affiliates. That would be inappropriate and is not something that the work group or the launch committee wants to create an opportunity for. So we haven't thought about the code of conduct per se as the way to address that. It probably should be folded into expectations about where you would belong in sort of the first instance before you get to the point of signing an agreement like a code of conduct. But it's a good flag and one we've thought about.
Excellent. Yeah, and thanks very much for outlining a lot of that in the paper. It gave a great way to start thinking about it. Thanks.
I think I would just add one more nuance is that one of the other pieces of this proposal, one of the values that we heard come through in these workshops is the ability to engage as a stakeholder on the issues that matter most to you. And so if a particular, I mean, I think we all have limited staffing resources, and to be able to identify those processes that are particularly important to you versus something where it's not of top interest for your organization, and to let people opt in certain ways to be a voting member in a process, but not have the obligation to always be a voting member in every process was a piece of this proposal, and maybe something we can flesh out as we get the comments back.
Thanks, Pam, Allie, and Spencer for those responses. So we are coming close to the end of our time. I am going to do just a read through of a few other comments that we received in Slido, so that the group has an opportunity to hear them as well. And then we are going to close out comments and just talk about what comes next. So just a few additional comments that were received in Slido. Challenged by the section on how voting is used. What are the RO board and staff's obligations to stakeholders, and can an elective override be used even if the threshold for automatic remand is met? The broad discretion and large role of RO staff in driving and developing initiatives seems to implicate some concerns given what I understand to be another aspect of the Step 2 proposal. Shared staff between the RO and CAISO and co-location in Folsom. How to ensure that California is thus not overrepresented in the initiative development and implementation process. And then what is the overall interest of the market that the RO board and RO staff is serving? So in the interest of time, we don't have time to air those out in the group, but I did want to make sure folks had an opportunity to hear what others in the group are thinking. The discussion today will be captured in as an amendment to the interim report that was distributed a couple of weeks ago. So the feedback will be there. All right, one last opportunity for feedback. Serena, if you could launch our final poll, and if Sarah, you could move 1 or 2 slides forward, I think. Yeah, this one. Oh, sorry, just one back. Just want to take a temperature on how people are feeling about the discussion document. Same Slido, just on a scale of 1 to 5, what's your reaction to the discussion document? From 1 being unhappy to 5 being pleased. And while you're mulling that over, Slido information is in the chat. We can move forward, Sarah, to our final slide. And great. So as I mentioned, the takeaways from our discussion today will be documented and added as an addendum to the interim report, thus becoming the final report. And you all have an opportunity to submit written comments about the discussion document. There is a stakeholder comment template up on the Weeb website already, I believe. It is extensive. Do not feel pressure to reply to every question in there. You can focus your energy in the areas that you feel are most important. And just a plea as the one who will be collating these comments, if you can follow the template, that would certainly make my life easier. Kathleen, Pam, anything you want to say about more generally, like where we go from here? Beyond, obviously.
Well, I just do want to take a few minutes to recognize and thank the GridWorks team for offering their support to this process. You know, we're a launch committee of volunteers, and having GridWorks step forward to help facilitate this really critical piece of the proposal has been invaluable. And I don't think we would have gotten this kind of robust dialogue or had the opportunity to get so much stakeholder engagement without the support of GridWorks facilitation through this process. So kudos to GridWorks. Huge thanks from the launch committee. Just really appreciate the support and the offering of that support to get us through this portion of our step 2 proposal. And I think with that huge round of applause, if we were in person, I would be clapping and encourage everyone to clap for the GridWorks team. But please know that there's thunder applause coming from our launch committee team in our own spaces. But then I would maybe ask Kathleen to close us out with some final thoughts on next steps.
Thanks, Pam, and I completely agree. This has really, I think, made this process incredibly valuable. So thank you, GridWorks team, for all of your work. As we kind of discussed there at the end, we have a lot of work to do at the launch committee level to incorporate all of the comments and input that we've gotten from these separate work groups. Thus far, the discussions that we've had in these workshops have really been the ideas and the products of discussion at that work group level. And so now we are bringing all of we're doing these revisions and taking it back to the launch committee to make sure that we are still operating within our own sort of diverse stakeholder group, and that we've got buy-off from the launch committee as a whole on what we're bringing to you at the end of September. So to that end, I know this is the September 11th is not only a very quick turnaround, it is also pretty close to when we're going to be having the full step 1, step 2 proposal, and we'll be asking for feedback on that as well. I would encourage you, if you have ideas and specific feedback on this, we really do want to hear input, and we really do want to continue to be able to incorporate stakeholder feedback into this stakeholder process recommendation. And to that end, I think we still have to kind of figure out how detailed we're going to get on this specific part for our September 26th step 2 proposal. Obviously, there's a lot to continue to work on, and so there may be sort of a separate ongoing opportunity for the evolution of this piece. But to the extent that we can integrate the purpose and the priorities and the high level intentions of this stakeholder process into our step 2 proposal, that's something that we're really going to be striving to do. So I really do encourage you to provide feedback at this stage, so that we can evaluate that as we're especially as it touches and impacts the other parts and other work of the work groups that we've been discussing over the last couple of months. And I think with that, if you have any other individual questions, feel free to reach out through your sector representatives on the launch committee. Feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to continue the conversation and really appreciate your engagement and your input and your thoughts and questions. And look forward to hearing from you in this next phase. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.